Hello, everyone, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, according to whichever parts of the world you are joining in. And welcome back to the HELE webinar series. We are so delighted to have you here. And we are also delighted to have Simon Dunton speaking to us today. Let me quickly introduce him. Simon is a PhD student at the School of Education, Learning and Communication Sciences at Warwick University, UK. And he is working under the supervision of Professor Richard Smith. And he is researching how English was taught and studied as a foreign language in secondary schools in Soviet 60s. And today he is going to take us on a journey in the past, a very interesting journey into a political entity which no longer exists, but still should be quite familiar to many of us, especially more elderly kind of people who have seen the collapse of Soviet Union firsthand. So we are delighted to have you here. Welcome, Simon, and over to you.
Thank you very much. And yes, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining today. Thank you for joining this, and thank you for inviting me along. I'm very honored to be one of the first to be presenting at these new series, the HELE webinar series. Honored and excited. My name is Simon Dunton, and I am currently undergoing, maybe that's the right verb, my PhD at Warwick under the supervision of Richard Smith. And as was already said, my interest is in the Soviet Union, and in particular the Soviet 60s, which I'll define in a minute, coming from my own interest, having lived and worked in Russia, not the Soviet Union, but having lived and worked there as an English teacher, and sort of combining my undergrad studies as a historian and my work experience as someone who worked and until quite recently worked as an English teacher, English as a foreign language, combining these and looking at how languages in general, but specifically English, really was taught and studied in the Soviet Union in this period. And I'll be looking at this from the perspective of the textbooks for this webinar, but looking at different sources that tell us about what the textbooks were, the methodologies underlying them, or underpinning them, and also how they were actually used in the classroom by teachers and by students. So again, just a little outline here. I will outline the historical context, why I've chosen this period and what it is. And then looking at those textbooks, we'll explore the methodological beliefs. And it's definitely an S there. There were lots of things going on during this period. The sort of changes in textbooks. I invite you to look inside some of the textbooks to see if you can see any of the differences and pick out some of the things I've picked out as well. How these textbooks were actually used by the students and the teachers. And also a look at the social and political influences of the kind of texts that were used alongside grammar exercises, etc. So, to get started into it, I should say as well, there'll be plenty of time at the end for discussion and questions, answers, comments. I very much welcome those towards the end of today's webinar. So just to set the historical context, I'm going to use Robert Hornsby's definition of the 1960s from his book that was published a few years ago. So that is from March 1953, the death of Stalin, through to the invasion of Czechoslovakia in August 1968. So that's the whole Khrushchev period and into the Brezhnev period as well. And I've chosen this period because much like Robert Hornsby, I think it's a very interesting period. We have the thaw, we have the questioning of Stalinism itself, the opening of the Soviet Union, lots more people visiting than might be expected, lots of people from the Soviet Union going out into the world, not just into those countries that were part of the Warsaw Pact, but well beyond that. And there was lots of discussion about internationalization. And as part of that, right in the middle of the period, among much discussion, there was in 1961 this resolution from the Council of Ministers of the USSR. And it's quite a large resolution in terms of what it is aiming or aimed to do, changing how foreign languages should be studied in terms of textbooks, in terms of the teachers from preschool all the way through to university. So just taking a small section of this, we can see here that in the context of what I'm going to be talking about today, the Council of Ministers was instructing the ministries in the various republics and the Russian Federation, well, what became the Russian Federation as well, to improve foreign language curricula for schools. And within the next 3 to 4 years, so between 1961 to 65 or 6, there should be new textbooks published that match or that are in accordance with the curricula. And special attention should be paid to their context to maximally promote the development of spoken skills and translating foreign texts without a dictionary. And these are two things that throughout the literature, teachers are talking about, pedagogues are talking about, increasing the ability of students to speak and also translating without a dictionary. These are two very key things throughout this period. This comes within the prospect or a much wider debate on learning and teaching foreign languages. And you can see here are 4 examples here of the kind of publications that were fairly widely available to any teacher and language teachers in particular. So this one on the left here is the Teacher's Gazette. You've got Soviet Pedagogy, People's Obrazovание, Education, I guess. And this one, more than any, this is a journal that was published 6 times a year called Foreign Languages in Schools. So it's exactly this. But in all of these texts, you can find arguments and debates about how reading should be done, the role of translation, pronunciation. I think this one in particular, Foreign Languages in School, has some excellent articles from teachers themselves. The section in each edition changed name, but very often it was something like teacher experience or from the classroom. So we have a real insight there of what teachers were actually doing in terms of language study in and out of their classrooms. And many of these were, some of the key texts were translated into English. So anyone that's interested, if you go to they're widely available online, they were translated into English in the journal Soviet Education, which only closed just a few years ago, actually. But so some of the key texts, not all of them, but some of them can be found in English. And I'll be exploring some of these a bit later. We also have eyewitness accounts of kind of what the current state of learning was, not just from teachers and observers that came from countries including New Zealand, Canada, America, the United Kingdom, and India, but also people that were not professional but were speaking English with Soviets on the streets. So I think a really interesting example is Sally Balfrage, who remarkably went to Moscow in 1957 to as part of the youth festival that took place there, and managed to get herself a job and lived in the Soviet Union for the next, I think, at least 12 months, where she worked as an editor, but managed to travel quite extensively in the Soviet Union, which is remarkable for the time and also for a woman. She was a British American living there. But as it says here, she met lots of people along the way, and everybody wanted to practice English. Because so many of them could read, they knew the history, the ins and outs of grammar. Some of them had even read Beowulf, but they simply couldn't speak. And a really interesting example is when she met the poet Sergei Yesenin's son, that she says he was a perfect example of how perfectly possible it is for in Russia to learn a foreign language without being able to speak a word of it. He'd actually translated English books, technical work on the most extraordinary learned level, but he could barely communicate anything verbally. So this is in 1958. So you can see why in this 1961 resolution, there's this big movement because lots of people have observed that there's a lot of focus on grammar, but people simply cannot speak foreign languages, including English. So this needs to change. So what does this mean, or what did this mean in terms of methodological beliefs during this period, so during the whole of the Soviet 60s? Well, I think it was kind of a very mixed bag, and it's quite messy, actually, surprisingly messy. When I think of the Soviet Union, sometimes I think of sort of uniform, top down, everyone doing the same thing. And indeed, some of the observers that went in the 1950s and 60s did say that every classroom looked very similar. The textbooks were very similar. The way they were being used was very similar and prescribed. But right from the core, the methodology was quite different. And there were two, perhaps even three schools of thought here. And it's sort of summed up in 1961 by Krusler here, who says that there was this long struggle between these two schools of thought, so the grammar translation and the direct method. And they're sort of talking to each other through these teachers' magazines that I showed earlier. One, of course, I think we're all familiar with grammar translation and direct method, what they mean, and they don't work together. And he finishes here by saying that the controversy has been prolonged because certain representatives of the older school occupy key positions in state universities. And we'll look at some of those people in a minute. Just as a side note here, though, we do have to be careful with this research because you can see it was written in 1961, and it seems to suggest that there was already a shift. Everyone was doing grammar translation, and now everyone is doing direct method. And for anyone that's done any work at all in the history of language learning and teaching, we know that these shifts don't happen overnight. They're messy. Sometimes they don't happen at all, and different people are doing different things. So it's not quite correct in 1961 to say the shift has happened, it's over, the debate is over. And the proof is in the pudding here, because in 1963, there were two schools of thought that argued quite bitterly amongst each other in two of those magazines I showed, the Soviet Pedagogy and Teaching Foreign Languages in Schools. And on the one side, you had people like Mirolubov and Rachmaninoff, who, as you can see here, they're going really what we might call grammar translation. It might be called something else, and I'll come to that in a second. But their big argument was that if there is a divergence between the native language, i.e. Russian, and that being studied, i.e. English, then there should be more native language used. So they looked at, say, the United Kingdom and said, well, there's similarities between French and English, so it's okay to use just French in the classroom. The differences between Russian and English are so great. English must be used. It must be used to compare things, to translate things, to look at how things work in completely different ways. If I want to say this in Russian, well, I have to say it like this in English. And this perhaps came from lots of people's ideas, but of course, one of the most important people in the Soviet Union was Vladimir Ilyich Lenin himself, who in 1901 wrote to his sister saying that he particularly recommended translations both ways. You do a written translation from the foreign language into Russian, and then translate the Russian back into the foreign language. And actually, Mirolubov and Rachmaninoff, they quote this, slightly misquote it, but they quote this in this article in 1963 to say, this is what we should be doing. But their article is actually quite confusing because they write a lot about how we should be comparing and contrasting the language with students all the time if we are teachers. But they almost conclude by saying that, of course, one language exercises should be given considerably more time than bilingual exercises, translation. Okay, so in other words, yes, the children in the class should be hearing and using English as much as possible, but there still needs to be a lot of translation, and bilingual exercises don't just mean translation. So it's not correct to completely exclude translation from one language into another. So that is their staunch position, which is seen as quite conservative and old-fashioned, and is attacked quite vehemently just two editions later in foreign languages for schools, by Gorolyov, who says that the contradictions between the principles of teaching advocated by the authors, the two we've just seen, of the article, and the measures that they suggest for improving methods are, in our opinion, obvious and irreconcilable. So it just doesn't work. And Gorolyov really pulls apart their argument and say it simply doesn't work. There isn't enough time in the classroom to do all the things you're talking about. Also, it leads to issues. If we're continually comparing, translating, then we get to this cycle of endless mistakes in pronunciation, word order, combining words, using too formal language, etc. So there's the conclusion here that we believe the attempt to rehabilitate the so-called conscious comparative method, so that grammar translation sort of, I'll talk about that in a second, which was so harmful to the teaching of foreign languages in our schools in the 1940s and 50s, does not serve the interests of the school. So this is to be put aside. We should not be going backwards, in other words. Just to pick up on this conscious comparative method, which was sometimes called the conscious practical method. So Belayev here says that it's got these two main features. So yes, the foreign language should be, without translation, it should be productive. There should be a lot of speaking, and that's recognized as a very important factor of instruction and how to learn a foreign language. But it's obligatory that students be given theoretical linguistic information prior to this practice. So priming them about how to learn a language, the differences in the languages, and so on. So it's quite diverse in terms of you've got the grammar translation, you've got direct, you've got conscious practical that might be something different. And Belayev definitely argues that it's not the two combined, it's something that's slightly different. So there's a lot going on here in terms of methodology, and I think it's interesting to look at the textbooks and say, well, what effect did this have on the textbooks, considering that 1961 resolution that said, let's look at this methodology and let's make sure the textbooks now represent that. I think it's quite messy. So let's have a look at some of the textbooks here, and I hope you'll be able to see these clearly enough. To give us a good idea of comparisons, I've taken the same book. So this is for the 8th class or 8th form, one version from 1958 and the other from 1969. So just beyond our period, but still very valid here. And I'm just going to show you the very first lesson, the first pages here, and give you a second just to compare it yourselves. And we might notice a couple of sort of maybe trivial type things there, that there's more animation. There's certainly more pictures in the 1969 as you work through this textbook here. It's more friendly. I find it quite interesting that you've got Welcome to the 8th form. I should mention as well that by this time, students of this school will have been learning English. This will be their 3rd year. They start in the 5th form usually. So these students will be about 14 or 15 years old and have had a couple of years of English already. So they're returning to school. And you see in this 1958, there's immediately a translation. There's no translation here in lesson 1. The questions are more or less the same here. And then it diverges quite differently here, because even here you've got lesson 1 in English, which you have here as well, but then you've got first section here, small differences, right? But then what happens after this is very, very different. So here it starts talking about the difference, and we're already into Russian straight in here, which talks about in the English language, the word country has 2 different meanings. And it starts going on about this country. It could be the town in the country, or country as in Russia is a country, England is a country. And they sort of explore that themselves, and they're told the difference, and then they're given examples of difference within text and within a joke. Whereas here, there's a joke, a different kind of joke here. And then it starts going into 2 schoolmates or 2 friends are talking. The 1969 version catches up a couple of pages later, and we see the same text more or less. Again, the addition of pictures here to aid some kind of understanding, so we know it's different people talking. And you might notice as well that in both cases, there are lots of arrows and markers being used here, because presumably these are to be read aloud, and it tells us the upward intonation and downward intonation of each and which words to stress here. You know, are you a new pupil? Yes, same here. Yes, I am. So we can see that it is here. Interesting, a couple of differences between those, but it's that focus again, going back to the resolution, before 1961 and afterwards. There is work here on immediately looking at pronunciation, and we're going to come back to that idea several times during this talk, no doubt. But small differences between these. It's not a grand difference. Considering the difference in time, these aren't huge differences necessarily. Although, again, I'd welcome any of your opinions towards the end here if you think there are much bigger things. And of course, there's more to explore within these books. Interestingly, in this exercise, by page 6, we're again translating. So we're reading the following sentences and translating just the word in the sentence that's given in Russian, in English, sorry. So we've got, when new people come to our school, we say, welcome to our school, and we have to translate welcome into the Russian in this side here. So we've got some translation here where it's giving us, I like to swim, and the same in Russian. And here we're immediately being asked to translate into Russian rather than being given a translation. We're in 1959 now in this book. So this is a class 7 book. A reminder, this will be that this is the third year of studying English now that have started in the 5th class. This is fairly typical of a reading text that they've got. This text, the 5 loaves of bread, is the one I'd like to focus on here. Again, we can see, and the instruction is also here, that it's recommended that this is for reading in class. We can see that this could be read out loud because we've got those intonation markers as well, but it's also followed by comprehension questions. Interesting, the questions in English, but the instruction in Russian, answer the following questions, and then the questions are in English. So a real mixture there of Russian being used and English. This same text is used. Now, note this is lesson 5 in 1959. If we go forward, and again, just to point out here, this is, again, this text is recommended for reading in class, and we've got the pauses and the intonation here. That's 1959. By 1969, we have the same text being used. We're in lesson 10, so it's much, much, much further along in terms of the school year. Same text. And now the text is not being used for reading. All of the markers have disappeared. In fact, we're told here, read the text to yourself and then translate it in written form. And it tells us right underneath here, this Indian tale is a text for translation. So translation certainly hasn't disappeared from these books in this one. And in fact, it's changed here from something that was read out loud to now a text that's being used for translation in this, with a few little sections here, some little glossaries for unknown vocabulary. Then later we might read the text out loud in exercise 2. And then we're using the same text to underline all the past indefinites in the text in this one. So the same text being utilized for lots of different things here. Now, of course, I think that's interesting to look at the textbooks, and I wish I could show you more and more of them because I have my own little pile here that are I love going through these myself. But with time as it is, we can't just look at the textbooks themselves. And I think it's important not only to look at how the textbooks changed or what the textbooks were telling teachers to do, but actually what the teachers and more importantly, the students were doing with them. And I know from my own copies here, my physical copies, that they were used for things like reading aloud and pronunciation. And I can tell that because the keywords have been underlined that would have been stressed. And sometimes the intonation has been drawn in the kind of marginalia, which is fascinating to see that that's what students were using it for. Even if the text was to be used for very similar to what we saw with those comprehension questions, they obviously did have to read it aloud, perhaps even memorize it, because you can see it's been written over so many times. So some more evidence of how textbooks were actually used. This is from a corpus of diaries that were written by various Russian people. Just anyone can still now send in their diaries to be digitized. This is Yuri Latishov. He's 16 years old, and he's writing on the 20th of August, 1965. He's got quite an interesting diary there. He talks about all sorts of stuff, school stuff, boys, girls, sports, all of the stuff you'd expect in a teenager's diary. He's 16 years old. And this section in particular stands out when he says, again, it's August, so it's his summer holiday. I've decided to spend some time each day translating something from my English for Class 10 textbook. Today, I translated 2 large texts, Joe Hill and The Legend of the King and the Old Poet. And this is actually that book here. This is exactly what he was translating. And the Joe Hill text itself, again, I won't show it all to you, but it's a good few pages long. This is the 10th class, so it could be his final year of study, but it's a good few pages of text. It's quite complex itself. Um, and we'll go back to social political influences later on in this talk, but I want to just give you a moment to read part of what he was translating. So here it is. So quite a complex text for him to be translating. Now, in the book itself, you are not instructed to translate this text. After the text, there are some discussion questions like, why was Joe Hill more often jobless than employed? How did they kill him? How did people try to save Joe Hill? Wouldn't get a text like this, I suppose, about killing and executions in many course books these days. The second text that he translates, the King one, that actually is the instruction in the book is to translate it. But this Yuri Latishov has decided that during the summer holidays, to sort of buff up and keep his English going, he's going to be translating. Whether he does more than these two texts, we don't know because he never mentions translation again in his diary entries. But I will go through them again to make sure that is 100% true. Interestingly, he is still alive. This tab here means he's still alive. So it'd be wonderful from an oral history point of view to actually talk to him if possible. He was born and raised and still lives in Chelyabinsk, just to give you an idea of not everything's based in Moscow or Petersburg. Continuing on, this is from the book Soviet Baby Boomers, which is mentioning oral history as I just did. This is an oral history study of the Soviet Union through the eyes of baby boomers, so people born in the 40s who lived and grew up in the 50s and 60s. Now, it's about their entire lives from, growing up post-war all the way through to the collapse of the Soviet Union. But there are some interesting sections in this book that are about their school years, because everyone interviewed in this book either went to school number 20 in Moscow, or I think it was school 15 in Saratov. The two schools are actually very interesting, and they just, for me, are interesting because they were English specialized schools. So rather than starting English at class 5, the students in these schools started English in class 2, and by the end of their studies, they were actually learning other subjects through English. It was an experiment, and according to this book, quite a failed experiment, but they did try to teach political science, some maths, and some sciences through English as well. But anyway, talking about the uses of the books here, I think there's a nice example of the idea that these students in these schools had kind of rote learning. Now, interestingly, the Moscow school actually had lots of visitors, including students from the UK. And there's a nice example here where one of the students, Marina Bakutina, as she's talking to the historian, Donald J. Rayleigh, who wrote this, and she cringed, telling me about her reply to a visiting English teen who asked about Moscow. I began to recite by heart a passage from our English textbook about what a great metro Moscow had, about when it was built, how much marble was used in constructing the subway. Of course, it was an altogether inappropriate reply, and I remember very well the look of amazement on the girl's face. So it's this kind of, they've learned these texts by heart about things, and it just came out from her. Other people in the book, however, remember having quite fluid and interesting conversations with their English counterparts. So it shouldn't be taken that everyone was just regurgitating texts. That is certainly not the case. And these oral histories, and I hope that my future oral histories will prove that not to be the case. But we must remember that this was a special English school. Whether this would have happened in other schools is unknown, because not very many foreign delegations, whether they were official visits or students, went to schools other than those specialized English schools. I wanted to include here, because I'm trying to use a range of materials, as you might notice. So I've got these teacher journals, we've got the oral histories, we've got diaries, but I think film is also an important resource for the historian looking at anything really, but for the historian looking at the history of this period in teaching. There are a few films that are certainly based in classrooms. And this one from 1972 is actually called Translation from English. And it's quite an odd film, actually, but it's all about this English teacher that you can see here. And what I'm going to try and do is share my screen in a second and let you watch just a little bit of this film. And I'll give you a couple of points just to notice here. Now, it's a film not about teaching English, but it's a nice scene inside an English classroom. So a few points to note here are that this character here, this young lad, has been called to the front of the classroom to recite and memorize texts. Just have a look at what all the other students are doing while he's doing that. Listen if you can to how many times the teacher interrupts the student as he's trying to memorize the texts. The real focus on pronunciation here, and also maybe the classroom layout. That's an additional, see what you can notice about the classrooms as we go through them. So let me try and re-share my screen in a second, as smoothly as possible. I will remember to share the sound. So hopefully you can all see this. And just watch this for a minute or two.
Ну, к делу, к делу. До моей болезни мы с вами взяли одну тему. Впрочем, нет. Тарасю, Гриша, помнишь наш уговор? Если для кого английского не было, то для тебя он был, не правда ли? Вон сколько точек в журнале. И под каждой подразумевается двойка. Итак, устный рассказик на любую из пройденных тем. Прошу.
My Sunday. In Sunday, on Sunday, I got up at 10 o'clock. I dressed and had breakfast. Then I went to my friend. We go to the zoo. We went to the zoo. At the zoo, we saw many animals. We saw 12 wild and
Кого это?
2 elves. After that,
Танки
we went
забильные.
home. After dinner, I went
Отрезал.
to the yard.
А ты не знал?
In the evening, I watched TV.
Watched. That's enough.
Ты старался, я вижу.
But your pronunciation.
Друзья, давайте отвлечемся на минутку. И я обращаюсь ко всем, прошу потише, и послушаем подлинный английский в его классическом совершенстве.
And I will pause it there, but she's about to play she's about to play Shakespeare to them to show them the proper way of pronouncing things. And they're all supposed to listen. Now, what I find interesting about this, and I'll switch back to my presentation now, as you can see, or hopefully you saw there, he's regurgitating a memorized text as far as I can work out here. Interaction pattern. Well, the teacher's listening but interrupting all the time. If you listen quite a few times to this, she continually corrects his pronunciation as he's trying to desperately remember these things. And nobody else is listening. Nobody else is doing anything. They're not expected to listen, ask questions. Only at the end when she stops him and says, well, you really tried, but your pronunciation, oh, your pronunciation. And then she puts on this tape of what sounds like a Shakespearean actor reading Hamlet about how wonderful it is. You might also notice in the classroom layout there were earphones as well for them to listen to, but they don't actually use that. And you can see that she's got a supply of tape decks and things here as well. I think films are an interesting way of looking at these. Of course, that's an idealized classroom in many ways, but it's the sort of thing, I guess, that would be familiar to the audience watching in 1972. That's what they would expect to see in a classroom. To move on slightly, we can also see that I find this was a very interesting visit of an Indian delegation that took place in 1961 and was written up in 1962, that was led by Singh. They traveled around different places in the Soviet Union. I believe they went to Kazakhstan, the Ukraine, and they were in Moscow, of course. On terms of these, the textbooks themselves, Singh remarks that they were, like the curriculum, almost uniform throughout the country. They serve as a powerful agency for maintaining uniformity of standards. Singh was really blown away by how wonderful everything was in the Soviet Union in many ways. There are political reasons for this as well, as the Soviet Union starts turning towards countries like India, as they got their independence and were moving towards it. The Soviet Union is trying to do more work in those kind of countries and make connections with them, as opposed to the West being involved there. But what I found interesting, here we have someone in 1962 as an official delegate saying that in all the visits to classrooms, we never came across any ragged or shabby books. Everything was perfect, everything was beautiful in the books themselves. But by 1976, and I know this is a bit later, this young student, she's 13 years old. She was in Vladikavkaz, which is near the Caucasus, or in the Caucasus. Bella, how would I say her name? Zdaparova. She's quite sassy, to use that word, in her diary entries, especially for a 13-year-old. And she writes here that in general, our English language textbook is like a rag. In fact, we call it a rag. This is what it looks like. And she's put a picture which is not available to us. And the inside doesn't look any better. In general, everyone in the class has this kind of textbook. The teacher has a new one from 1972, and we all have these rags from 1968. So even to the point of what the textbooks look like, whether they were in new condition or rag condition, there is argument. There's lots of space here as an historian to look through. Some people are saying this, some people are saying that, and I find that myself quite fascinating. We're not going to watch a second clip here, but I wanted, this is another film that I find interesting from 1968. This is, again, a film about a history teacher and an English language teacher. And in this very short scene, which is so short, I won't show it to you, but I can explain it. The students are all sitting very nicely. They've all got their brand new, and you can see beautiful textbooks here. And she asks them to close their books and gives them a spot quiz where she says in Russian, how do you say in English? And this one child at the back stands up and says, to ride, rode, ridden, and everyone claps and everyone is happy. I guess, again, this is a fictional film, but this kind of spot quizzing would have been quite familiar to the students of the time. And in fact, Singh, going back to that report, writes at least one episode where he sees that students are individually called up to the classroom and they're told to complete an exercise on the chalkboard or to read something out or to memorize something one by one. Sometimes the class is invited to listen and ask if that was correct, and other times it's unclear what the class is supposed to be doing. But a couple of things to notice from this film is there's this use of a new textbook, and I'll explain why I'm saying that in a second. The translation, again, translation of key text to say, how do you say this? And then give the three forms of the verb, and answering at the front of the class. Now, I say here that this is a new textbook. This film is 1968, and by doing a little bit of investigation here and watching several scenes of this film, possibly too many times, this is in fact the book English, Ninth Form by Zarubin from 1968, so brand new book that they were using here. So really this is a kind of idealized classroom using the most up-to-date textbooks. I think this is a nice textbook to finish off with before we look at the socio-political aspect of this. In the second section of this talk, which will be a bit shorter, because here's the typical page. We're in the ninth form now. So again, students would have studied from the fifth form. This is quite a few years. And this is all about Lenin in London, quite a complex text in terms of language, but also we can see here that threading in of Leninist Marxism throughout the texts. And we see this from quite young ages as well. And I think that's a nice place to look at this socio-political influence that the books had and gave to the students as well. And of course, the presence of political propaganda is a characteristic of these books, and that was noted by Benson back in 1959. And I guess here we see from quite an eminent Russian historian saying that, the whole purpose of the Soviet school, with its wall newspapers, Lenin corners, councils, committees, and we could say textbooks here as well, was to instill in the children the idea that they too were potential revolutionaries and should be ready to rise up in revolt, if necessary against their own parents. There were very famous stories about that, like Pavlik Morozov, which is an interesting side story, if they were called upon to do so by the party leadership. So party above parents. I don't find that in the textbooks themselves there's really strong elements. I think you'd have to really read between the lines there. But there are certainly lots of interesting historical and social political things that we can pick out. The most obvious of those would be, well, let's look at this textbook from 1948, before our period, but we can clearly see here we've got Lenin sitting next to Stalin. Well, after the secret speech and after his death, of course, Stalin disappears from these books. He's not spoken about for obvious reasons. It was not comfortable to have Stalin in these textbooks, but Lenin remains throughout. So you might have something that's very similar to this, but the questions about the early life of Comrade Stalin would completely disappear and everything would focus on Lenin. So here's a book for a class, a grade 3 class. So again, this would have been in a specialized school where English was started at a much earlier age. And we've got a poem about Lenin and how wonderful he was here. We've also, it's not just stories about Lenin, it's also things like how things are better now than they were in the past. So here's a good example here from a lesson where we've got a picture of an old, smoky, rundown kind of place where grandfather used to live, because we've got a text about grandfather. But now it's a modern, new, wonderful place to live because all of these houses have been built. Things are much better here. So we've got the past tense and we've got this. We've got workers lived in small houses. There were very few hospitals. There were very few schools. But now the workers live very well. They live in fine, large houses. They have time to rest. Their children can go to school. Their life is joyful and happy. So these are quite young children. We're talking 9, 10-year-olds at the very beginning being told how wonderful things are at the moment and how bad they were before. We also have a kind of influence in terms of talking about other countries. So here's an example. There's a much longer text about this character's father going to London. And there are some interesting and quite funny bits that come up here. So for example, Victor's father and his friends went to see the London Underground. There are very many trains there, but the stations are not beautiful. They do not look like the stations in Moscow or Leningrad metros, but there are very many of them. So again, we're told that things are better in Moscow, in Leningrad. No matter where we live in the Soviet Union, things are better than perhaps in these capitalist countries. And even going back to this idea of translation being a big thing, here is quite a large text, one of the largest I've seen in textbooks, where students in the 6th class are being asked to translate this text from Russian into English. And the text is all about a sort of collective farm, basically, the collective area, and how things used to be and how things are now. So we've got this beautiful long streets. On the one side, there's a club. The club is big and beautiful. The collective farmers often get together there and they can watch many interesting things, etc., etc. So how they live in a much wonderful way. So they're being told again, as they're learning English and translating, this idea of what their country is outside Moscow as well as within it. I'm sort of drawing to an end here because I am interested in hearing your thoughts and questions, but it would be impossible for me really to talk about textbooks in the Soviet Union without mentioning a very well-known textbook which is still used today, and that's a textbook by Natalia Bonk. And anyone that spent time in Russia or has learned English in Russia will know the Bonk books. There have been many versions of them from 1960 all the way through to fairly recently, although she did pass away a few years ago, as you can see. But the book is still used, sometimes in secondary schools, but very often in higher education as well. It's in 2 parts, quite a formal book in many ways, quite prescribed in terms of grammar and very regimented. Bonk herself said that she liked the second part of the textbook much better because the texts in the first were very idealized and artificial, and she was talking about the 1960 version here. But they were reworked when the book was republished. But she'd say that the text in the second part, even from 1960, even now could be used as reading and discussion material. She did change methodologies as she went on, and she wrote other books as well that were much more communicative in their methodology and approaches. And this book, just to prove how well known this book was and how widely used, many of you will know or remember Yuri Andropov, who was the leader of the Soviet Union towards the very end of its existence, just before perestroika. I think from 1982 to 84, I believe, so not very long here. But while he was the head of the KGB, he was visited by a man called Igor Sinitsyn. And in his memoirs, this is how vivid this memory is. In his memoirs of walking into Andropov's office, Sinitsyn notes that in front of the window on the far left stood a writing desk on which towered a pile of books, brochures, and pamphlets, on top of which a copy of the English textbook by Bonk could be seen with marked pages. So proof there that even the head of the KGB was using this textbook to brush up on his English language skills. So drawing to an end of my talking, I think there's lots of areas of investigation. And as I started this presentation today, I am at really sort of the beginning of my PhD journey in many ways, but I'm interested in all of these kind of questions about the influences on the changes in textbooks, where they changed and where they didn't, according to the methodologies of the time and the social geopolitical events. But I'm really interested also in how they were actually used. So looking at the artifacts themselves with the marginalia, talking to people about what they remember, how they were used, finding more video footage or diary entries about how they were used, as well as those prescribed guides like teacher guides or the teaching journals I mentioned, where teachers actually write, this is what I'm doing in my classroom, which I find fascinating. And finally, what the students actually learned from these textbooks. How did they find them in terms of their usefulness? And that will hopefully become clear during oral history interviews. But more ideas on this, arguments, everything is welcome, because I'm very happy to talk about all of this for hours and hours and hours and hours. And at that point, I will finish, and I'm very happy to take any questions people have.
Please.
Hi, Simon. Thank you for the very interesting and very insightful presentation. It must take a lot of time, to collect all of the valuable resources from diaries of people in Russia to know that very snippet of how they mention English language textbook. I do have a question about the intonation markers in the textbook that you mentioned. From how I understand it, they somehow remove the intonational markers in later textbooks, right? And you think the purpose could be for more focus on translation? Is it? You're on mute.
Yes, I think in some cases we can see evidence of that, but not necessarily. So that one that I showed there, the idea was first that they would read it to themselves, then they translate it through writing, but then later they might read it aloud, but they're not given the markers. But that text was moved later on into the book. So perhaps, well, if you look at the textbook, they've already done quite a lot of work on texts or with text with those markers, but they've now been removed as a kind of test of where they think they should be using intonation rather than just being told where it should be.
I mean, could there be a possibility that because the marker are just annoying, maybe they are still teaching pronunciation, but maybe they have some sort of feedback that the intonation can be demonstrated by the teacher, so they just remove it from the textbook. Is there any sort of teacher's book that go accompany that?
So yeah, that's an interesting. Teachers' books did come along a little bit later with some of these ones, but not with all of them. But they were given guides in other methods or other ways as well. I think when it comes to that, what's interesting is when you get physical copies or some of the copies that have been digitized that were used, you can see that the students have left markers on them. So that means either the students themselves were still using those intonation markers, or perhaps the teacher, even though the markers were not there, the teacher had decided the students needed them, or, I think that it's sort of a little bit of perhaps teacher agency, perhaps, or the teacher's refusal to follow the methodology that the book is telling them to follow. They say, no, I'm not going to use it for this, I'm going to use it for that. Because it was quite prescribed, and there are people like an observer DeWitt who went to lots of places in the Soviet Union and wrote about it in 1961, where he says things were quite uniform. There were 45-minute classes, and you can almost break down each minute. The first few minutes is this, the next few minutes they do this, the next, whatever the lesson was, wherever they were, they saw the same thing. But there seems to be evidence that wasn't always the case, because we've got those markers within the books, which I find that those are an interesting thing. And again, perhaps oral history will tell us a bit more about that.
Thank you. That's very insightful.
Yes, Peter.
Yes. Thank you for that wonderful talk, Simon. I just wonder what the motivation of the learners for learning English in the Soviet 60s was. What was the motivation from their side, or what were the reasons that were given to them from the side of the teachers or the establishment for encouraging them to learn English? Was English a compulsory subject as well? Thank you.
That's a great question. In terms of it being compulsory, English wasn't compulsory, but a foreign language was. So generally, you had German, English, and French. And at the beginning of this period, German was actually taught far more widely than English, because there were German-speaking regions of Imperial Russia that then became the USSR. And then over time, English overtook it. As to the reasons behind it, some of the oral history stuff reveals that parents were being told in gazettes and newspapers aimed at parents, make sure your child learns a foreign language. They will need it in the future, because they can read articles from abroad. It wasn't about traveling or going anywhere, but they can read articles from abroad. They can keep ahead of everything and make sure that they can build towards true communism by staying ahead of everything. That was certainly part of it. And there was also, even in some novels, characters from novels as early as the 1930s were, I always forget the name of this book now, but it will come back to me. One character in particular, he starts teaching himself Russian on this collective farm, and someone says, "Why are you doing it?" And he says, "Well," sorry, he starts teaching himself English. "Why are you doing this?" And he says, "Well, there's going to be a world revolution soon, and those English people, they'll need to know what communism is. So I'm learning English now so I can teach them when the world revolution happens," that kind of thing. So I think that was happening. There was certainly an elitism to it. So the children that went to those specialized language schools, they came from parents of the intelligentsia normally. So there was definitely elitism there, and those people may have traveled abroad a bit more. So yeah, lots and lots of reasons there. But I think that's something I'm fascinated with, and I'd like to ask more questions to people during oral histories, because I think that's very important. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, Nadia, please.
Yeah. Hello, Simon. Thank you very much for your talk. It was super interesting, and that my study is connected to yours. So, yeah, I'm very curious about maybe the image or the role of the teacher and what professionalism of an English teacher means. So, it was already mentioned that maybe teachers' books or some teacher manuals existed, and I imagine that they do not accompany every book that you look at. But have you already looked at some of them, and maybe have any ideas about this role, image, and professionalism? So is the teacher seen as the ambassador of the culture connected to the language or something like that? And whether they mention any linguists like Vygotsky, or psychologists like Galperian, and explain why the methodology is like that in teachers' books, because modern teachers' books don't usually have that. But I've noticed that in the 90s, teachers' books still had this theorization of theoretical basically the theory explained, underlined the methodology.
Yeah, excellent questions. So for the first one, with the role of the teacher, if we go back to that 1961 resolution, as part of the resolutions there, they say that there should be much stronger training for anyone that's teaching any foreign language. And they recognize that there are teachers before or in 1961 who are teaching a language that they do not know themselves. And that should be completely not a thing. So they are moving towards a more professionalized movement there. They want better teacher training, and that will include the teachers themselves having a better knowledge of the foreign language. So that's definitely a thing that's happening. With the teacher guides, there were things that were sent out. There were sort of syllabus that really told you lesson by lesson what you should be doing. So it's almost like a teacher's guide, but just a step-by-step what you should be doing. Here's the homework you set. Here are the answers to this. There's not a lot of methodology in those ones, for the earliest ones that I found. But the methodology all comes through, especially that journal, Foreign Languages in Schools, which Singh again notes that in every school that he and the delegates went to, they found copies of that journal. So it was, according to him, widely available. Lots of people were reading it, and you find lots of stuff in there, like the bits that I was showing you, but way more about teaching, sometimes how to teach German, how to speak French, English, languages in general. So that definitely comes up in those. And in fact, sometimes because they're rushing to meet the deadlines of the 1961 resolution, some of the people that are writing these books, they say, well, we didn't have time to publish the teacher's guide for it, but here in this article, you can see what you need to do for next term. It's kind of like, it's quite on the back foot a little bit. But your last point there in terms of theories, I haven't seen Vygotsky's name mentioned at all, but Scherber and others have been mentioned, definitely. But Vygotsky just, no. I mean, there's a very interesting history behind that, I think. He didn't come up until a lot later.
But related to that, there were also some, in a sense, radical experimentation going on. We have Sukhomlinsky and Shukshin.
Yes.
So were they not acknowledged anywhere? Or wasn't there any influence of those people or their ideas?
Yes, I think there were, and there are other textbooks that I couldn't show because there's quite a wide variety of them. But yes, you do see it. So you've got textbooks that have more of a sort of step-by-step, almost psychology link to them. And you can definitely link those back to other theorists going on there. And some of them come from applied linguistics in this area, and some of them from a more psychology or general pedagogy. I think, yeah, there is a breadth of information being sent out. And it's interesting how the textbooks came about, because some of the textbooks were written, basically the education department said, well, we trust you, you're experts, write them. But there was also a second way where even teachers had the opportunity of writing materials, sending them in a kind of competition. And some of them could be published that way, and then they'd be paid for them in different ways. I don't have data at the moment, however, to know how many of those actually got through. But there was certainly a lot of experimentation. You find things in the 50s where they're teaching preschoolers, for example, English, to see how that works. So, and those all appear on the pages of those journals and gazettes that I showed, some of which have been translated into English, but many have not as yet. I just want to point out the comment that's in here by Nadia as well. I find that interesting as well. There was actually a study in Israel in 1996 where they took people who were studying English as a foreign language, and they compared how Russians who had just recently immigrated to Israel compared to those that had been there for quite some time, how they studied in the same class. And they found those that had recently immigrated, so we're talking in the 90s, maybe late 80s, they brought with them all of the methodologies, the rote learning. They loved writing lists of vocabulary and words and repeating things and translation, whereas those that had lived in Israel for much longer were doing what we might recognize as more contemporary, sort of communicative, only speaking English, etc. So I very much agree with that, yeah, sometimes things didn't change at all. They stayed very similar.
Since the floor is still open, can I ask you one more question? I wonder what the condition of the teacher training or teacher education was at that time, and were teachers sent out by the government to be trained and do higher studies in English or English language teaching to English-speaking countries? Because as far as we all know, there were none of the English-speaking countries were communist countries then. So what kind of higher education or progression was there for teachers?
Yes, so there were certainly centers. The Gorky Center was one of them. Also, Voronezh was a big center of language learning experimentation. So there's lots of stuff there. It would be fascinating to get into their archives. Unfortunately, not possible at this moment. But yes, and they were experimenting with lots of ideas there. They were also reading lots of Western materials as well. So you get mention of everyone from Palmer all the way through to whoever. They're keeping abreast of things. And when it comes to sending teachers out, yes, they did that as well. And in fact, at Warwick, we have the Modern Records Centre, and they have reports from, I'm going to get this wrong because I can't find my notes here, which is annoying, but people that were sent to the Soviet Union. And they were supposed to be Russian teachers, not all of them were, but they were supposed to be Russian teachers who went there to learn Russian, to kind of get better at Russian, and also to observe how English was taught as a foreign language. And Russians, it was an exchange. Russians came over and did the same thing in the United Kingdom. So that was definitely happened. I have lots of evidence of that, and they were state-funded and supported missions that happened throughout the late 50s and early 60s.
Yeah, so despite all the disbelief that was there between the two blocks, there were still teachers going out and coming in from both sides.
My research so far has been, I found it surprising how porous it was. There were a lot of delegates going out there and visiting. There was a lot of exchange going on, more than I thought. We're not talking huge amounts, but a lot more than I thought there would be. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I guess we can wrap up the session now. May I request Prithviraj to conclude the session?
Sure, sir. Thanks, Simon. Thank you so much. I'm here to place on record my sincere thanks to you, Simon, for this wonderfully illuminating talk, enlightening talk. And we would like to have you again and again, because this talk has served as an appetizer for us, and we are hungry for many more such talks, as you must have noticed from the questions. So I thank the University of Warwick, and also thank AS Hornby Educational Trust. We are also grateful to INET Association of English Teachers for partnering in this series with us and putting things together. So I thank the entire INET family, particularly the technical team who is managing all the technical side of this. And I must not forget to thank my colleague, Dr. R. Vanella, and He Sang, who are the series coordinators for this HELE webinar series. And last but not the least, all the participants who have stayed here and made this webinar a success. So